Hi all, this is Allmighty and welcome to this video. Today we are continuing with the Instructive Endgame series, and as you can see, this is only the second video, so keep in mind that the video format is still evolving. So today we are going to do a little bit of a twist. So it will be different from the first video where I just chose a random game with a random topic and decided to a little bit analyze it and talk about the endgame and what you should do in it. There was actually a suggestion in the comments in that video that I should probably take a little bit of a more systematic approach, talk about a specific topic, and this is what I'm going to try to do today. So mentioned in the comment, what was also mentioned in the comment was a book by Mikhail Shereshevsky, The Endgame Strategy, which I will also put a link into the description so you can check it out, also read it. I already read a couple of chapters. It is a very nice book, so I definitely recommend it. So yeah, if you don't want to read the book, yeah, you're also welcome. We are also welcome to look at videos on this channel. That being said, just to move from the introduction, today I decided to cover the first topic, and coincidentally the first topic from the book as well, how to think in the endgame. And just to prepare you, I will be talking pretty much most of the time in this video, not so much going into variations and everything, because the idea is to talk about the things you need to think about when you're playing the endgame. So for the first topic, pretty general and abstract one, and I decided to choose a game, and the game was of course from the master of the endgame, Raul Capablanca, playing in 1936 in Moscow, Russia, in a tournament against Viacheslav Ragozin. For Ragozin, probably most of you have heard. If you haven't heard about the player, you have definitely heard about the Ragozin variation. But Ragozin, you need to know that he was a very strong player for that era. That being said, as always, I'm going to, in this series, I'm going to start from the beginning of the game, because I'm the firm believer that to actually know how to, play the endgame and to know in which type of endgames you should actually, which types of endgames you could actually reach. It is very important that you know from which openings you are going to get into those endgames. So here we have Capablanca with the white pieces, Ragozin with the black pieces, and Capablanca, to my surprise, starts with d4. And after a couple of moves, we do have the Nimzo Indian on the board, after which Capablanca goes into a little bit of a sideline with queen to b3 and e3 on the board. But okay, the game continues, and after a couple of moves, we do see that Ragozin actually sacrifices the pawn for activity and having the bishop pair. A very good idea here, but only after a couple of moves and after earning some tempos, Capablanca manages to equalize. The game simply continues. Capablanca grabs another pawn here, but this time Ragozin, after the queen exchange, decides to grab the pawn on e4. Exchanges ensue, and here, just after a couple of moves and the maneuvering with the knights, we reach the critical position in the game, which is this one, where, I would like to start off this video. So Capablanca with the white pieces and Ragozin with the black pieces. First and foremost, before going into any analysis or anything, I would always like to evaluate the position from white perspective and from black's perspective. So clearly we see right off the bat that white is the better one, having a pawn advantage. Looking at the heavier pieces, both of the players have the rook, and looking at the lighter pieces, we have a knight against the bishop. A bishop in a little bit of an advantage in the endgame because he can cover more ground, but of course knights aren't without their advantages. That could be also very problematic, being able to give forks and moves such as those. But okay, now we have this position on the board, and most of the people, when they are in openings and, for example, they find themselves in a variation that they don't know, or for example they are in some middle game, they are trying to calculate some tactic trying to find out the best move. They think in terms of variations. And this is actually why I wanted to cover this as the first topic, because in the endgame you shouldn't think in terms of variations. Because, for example, here, if we would think in terms of variations, we would say king to f1, for example, a move or a variation that I would like to make. King to f1, black plays king to e7, I play king to e2. What happens if rook to b7 is played? Then I have to play b4 or rook to b2. But what if bishop to d7 or bishop to d5 is played? For example, the knight is attacked, then knight to e5. But that doesn't make sense, because I don't want to think move by move, because as you can see, the possibilities are endless, because we are in an endgame, and your opponent and you have endless possibilities of moves that you can choose from. But that is actually the wrong way how to do this. To go and progress in the endgame, you should think in terms of what do you actually want to do with your pieces, which means you would like to put your pieces on the best available positions for them, and you would like to achieve positions in the endgame that you already know, and you should strive for them so that you can come into a position that you already know, and the position from which you know how to win the game, because then from that position you can easily win. You have that psychological advantage in comparison to your opponent. Here, Capablanca clearly states that he wants to move his pieces to a better squares, to the best possible squares for them, and that means as follows. He wants to put the rook on c3. Okay, let me back up a little bit. One other thing that I would like to mention is not just putting your pieces on the best available positions, also disabling opponents' threats. That is very important. It is very important to not allow your opponent to have some kind of a counterplay, because if you allow your opponent's counterplay, then that means that you could get in some trouble. If you just, for example, go and try to push your a pawn here, then you don't, for example, look on the king side. Maybe in that time black tries to do something there, gain some advantage, and all of a sudden you have to fight on the king side, and you are not able to push the pawn to a promotion, thus not being able to win the game. And one clear counterplay that black can actually have here is pushing of the c5 pawn to c4, making the b2 pawn a weak pawn. So of course not immediately, because you can simply capture, but of course with support. You don't want to allow that. So Capablanca starts first. Expansion on the king side, creating a passed pawn, means I need to push my pawns. To stop that pawn, I can play b4, but to play b4, I have to defend the pawn on a3, which means I have to play the rook to c3. Now the queen side is finished. Now I move on to the king side. What is on the king side? I have the knight, the pawns, and the king. First, I would like to move the knight into center of the board on e5 or d4, because from the center of the board, knights can cover much more ground. As we said, bishops are a little bit better because they go long distance, but knights in the center of the board, I would argue, are just as good. So playing knight on e5 or knight to d4, you see that there is already some kind of a attack going on with your knight. After moving the knight, you can move the pawns and spend on the king side. For example, playing f4, grabbing space on e5 or g5, playing g4, or even putting the pawns on dark squares, because very important, if your opponent has a light square bishop, you should put your pawns on the dark squares. If your opponent has a dark square bishop, you put them on the light squares. And last but not least, the king. The king is very important piece in the endgame, the part of the game where the king becomes alive, and it is very important to centralize your king, because from the center the king is closest to the both sides of the board, and he can very quickly enter into the battle there, which means putting the king, for example, here e3 d4 on one of the main squares, and then see how you can proceed with the game. So let's just see the couple of moves that they made. We see knight to d4, as we said, rook to b7, b4, bishop to d7, f4, king e7, king f2, rook a7, rook to c3, king to d6, rook to d3, king to e7, king to e3, rook to a4, rook to c7, rook to c3. And okay, just so you know, those moves that were currently made, so these couple of moves, weren't necessarily the best moves in the position, but that doesn't matter. You don't need to, for example, if you have a clear advantage like Capablanca has in this position, you don't need to make clearly the best moves that, for example, the engine would say. And that doesn't mean that you are making mistakes. What is very important is to position your pieces to the best possible squares, as I've said at the beginning. From then on, you can continue with the pawn push, you can continue with the rook push, or whatever you need to do to create weaknesses in your opponent's position, and then later on continue with your game and slowly go towards to that win that you definitely want. So now that we are positioning our pieces in the center of the board, one problem occurs. How to continue with the pawn push here? Well, it is clear that the rook on a4 and bishop on d7 are in a very good communication, and you shouldn't just simply start and pushing the pawns without them having a proper support. So one thing that happened in the game, and that you should definitely think about, is that you can quite easily bring the king to this side of the board, and when the king is on the support, pushing of the pawns is much easier. But okay, that isn't the only way how to win the game. But for example, if that is the way how you know that you will win the game, you should definitely strive for that one. On the other hand, you could, for example, as I've said, play g4, play f5, expand on the king side, play knight to f3 with knight to e5, and all of a sudden you could maybe have some attack on the other side of the board. Playing on both sides of the board in the endgame is also a very important topic that I will cover later on in the series. But okay, let's see one other thing which is also very important for the endgame. What happened here? King to d6, rook to d3, king to e7, rook to c3. As we can see, black is defending the c7 pawn and white is trying to play rook to d3 and have some discoveries. But we enter in some sort of repetition of moves. And of course, white is the one that doesn't want to repeat the moves because that would mean it would be a draw. But besides, so instead of that, I would say that making, and the book also argues that making repetition of repeating the moves, making repetition of moves. So repeating the moves and being the side that is actually active, so the one side that has the material advantage or strategical advantage, is a psychological advantage in the end, because quite simply, when you play the classical game, so I experienced this many times, you are on the side which has the advantage, you repeat the moves, black kind of thinks that okay, maybe this will be a draw because my opponent doesn't know what to do, and then suddenly you make a different move. It kind of messes with your psyche. So using this as a psychological thing in your game is a definite plus, so I would encourage that as well. But okay, to move on from that, let me just continue with Capablanca's plan. So shifting the king to the other side of the board, first he played knight to e2, we see g6 and rook to d3 check, king to e6 and king to d4. You see, the king is slowly moving to this side of the board, the rook is here defending the pawn, and I will go back later in the game to this move g6 and the later on f5 that will be played. Here, Ragozin could have maybe entered in the variation where he could have defended this endgame with the light pieces, so playing bishop to b5, attacking the rook and the knight, and after knight to c3, bishop to d3, knight to a4, bishop to f1, knight to c5, king to d6, g3, bishop to h3. So this is a forced variation. He could have maybe gone for this because here bishop to g2 kind of watches this diagonal, and it could be a little bit more difficult for white to actually push it and go for the advantage, but there is still knight to e4, and already having a pass pawn here is a definite advantage for white, so still this is a winning endgame for white. But okay, didn't want to go too much into analysis here, wanted to see what actually happened in the game. So instead of going for this, Ragozin decided to play rook to a6, and now we have a rook to e3 check, king to d6 and knight to c3, and now we see that this position, the pieces have been a little bit remaneuvered. We see that knight on c3 is now definitely available because after rook to a3, knight to e4 is a check. With a discovery, a rook will fall. So black cannot capture on a3, and Capablanca uses this to his advantage. Still, the idea is to bring the king closer. After this, we see f5, b5, first pawn push, rook to a8, and king to c4, bishop to e6, and king to b4. And here, finally, the king has entered the queen side. Now he can continue with the pawn push. In this position, actually, Ragozin surprises a little bit. He decides to break open the queen side, plays c5, and this simplifies the position. Capablanca captures, and now bishop is being played to g8. Why don't capture immediately? Of course, because rook to e6 grabs a whole piece. So bishop to g8, we have knight to b5 check, king to c6, and after this, rook to d3. We reach one of the final positions in which I will talk about in this game. Now, as I've said, I will come later on to these moves g6 and f5. In some of the positions when you are active on one side of the board, for example, here Capablanca or White has been mostly playing on the queen side because his main idea was to push the pawns to create a passed pawn, because a passed pawn is a definite advantage. And when you find yourself in a position such as in Black's position, the problem is that you sometimes don't want to make a move on the queen side because you know that your pieces are, let's say, optimally for that side of the position, for that side of the board. And in order to not move the pieces, you move the pawns on the other side of the board, and then after which you actually create weaknesses in your game. And that is exactly what happened, first with g6 and then with f5. Ragozin created some weakness on the king side, and instead of here rook to d3, Capablanca could have just simply played a4, a5, continue with the pawn push. There is no immediate danger for him, but he decided that he can also play on the other side of the board, playing rook to d3, threatening to give a check and go for this, for this weak pawn on g6 and on h6. So we saw g5, rook d6, king b7, pawn captures, and rook to g6. You see that this pawn cannot be defended, and after this move, this pawn was captured as well. f4, and for last but not least, knight to d4, not allowing the f3 push. Clearly, it is a winning endgame. A very important thing here is to know that for the later on in the game, Capablanca used the rule that he can attack on both sides of the board, but he could have just simply continued with his own plan, which is from the beginning, transfer all your efforts to the queen side and then create a passed pawn, which will be used then to promote to a queen and win the game. So let me just quickly show you what happened in the game. We see rook to c8 threatening rook to c4. So first check, king b6, another check, and knight moves to b5. Then rook go back to f8, knight to d6 check, king goes to b8, and after h4, when Ragozin saw that Capablanca starts to push on both sides of the board, he knew that, for example, even if he pushes f3, white can capture. Playing a game where you have two pawns on two sides of the board, it is pretty much unstoppable. So he resigned here, and this is pretty much it. As I said, mostly I was talking, and just for a recap at the end of this video, a couple of things. When in endgames, don't think in terms of variations. Of course, there are specific situations where you can think, I play this, he played this, I play this, I play this. But those are specific situations when you are cornering, for example, a little part of the board. But when you're thinking globally in terms of the whole board and the whole endgame, you should think in terms of positions. Which position do I want to achieve? How do I handle my opponent's threats? So play against your opponent's counterplay, not allowing counterplay, and of course repetition of moves when you are the active side is a very good idea. And many topics yet to come, so those are the only things you should think about, but this is a general, more abstract topic where you should just think, okay, this is how I should think about, and then just proceed with your game. You have a clear advantage on one side, you should play on that side. If you learn how to win with having a pawn advantage on one side, you should always strive to that types of position, because, as I said, you will have a psychological advantage for the future games that you would play, and it will be much, much easier to win those games. So that being said, Hopefully that video, you like this type of video. In the future there will be more analysis and more variations, but just for now, me and a lot of talking. That being said, as I said, I hope you enjoyed this video. My name is Allmighty, and I will see you in the next one. Enjoy.